I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you before we begin this edition of the program that I need your support to help keep this show going. So please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that out of the way, I know I've been overloading you on shows this week, but we have so much happening, whether it's talking about Netanyahu's visit to Washington, D.C., meeting with Trump, or whether we're talking about Trump's tariffs. Earlier today, I had a chance to speak with the Left Business Observer's Doug Henwood. He's also the host of the Behind the News radio program, which is a big inspiration for this show. I reached out to Doug because I wanted to get his take on Trump's tariffs. Well, there's been some new developments since we planned this interview. In fact, 30 minutes before we did this interview, a lot changed with these tariffs. Namely, there's been a 90-day pause made by Trump on some of these tariffs. So that's big news. Everything is just moving so quickly. And we're going to talk about all of it in the conversation to follow. Doug is a longtime analyst of economics and politics from a left-wing perspective. And we're going to get that perspective in the following conversation. With that being said, let's get right to it with Doug Henwood. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I haven't had on in a while, and I regret that because he's one of my favorite voices out there in the world of left-wing and progressive media. Doug Henwood is the host of the Behind the News radio program, which is a big influence on my own show. I get a lot of guests after listening to that program. And we're going to be talking about the tariffs. And there's just been some new developments with Trump doing a pause on some of these tariffs and the EU retaliating with their own tariffs. What do you make of all of this?
Well, the fact that everything we're about to talk about just changed, I think, like a half an hour before we started talking. It's just emblematic of this whole situation. I don't normally find myself identifying or experiencing any sympathy for automobile executives. But, if I were an executive at Ford or something, trying to plan production across North America over the next month or year or whatever, I don't know what I would do. I mean, it's just so chaotic, and the integration that the automobile industry has engineered over the last decade or two across North America. We may not like it, but it's reality, and it's what we have to live with. And the fact that it's just been completely upended for really unclear goals. I mean, it's really hard to figure out what Trump is all about. One minute we're about rebuilding manufacturing in the U.S. The next minute it's about revenues. The next thing it's about American honor and pride. And a lot of it just comes down to his ego. You saw that clip of him speaking to, I think it was a Republican congressional gathering on Tuesday night, where he's saying, people are lining up to kiss my ass. I think that really has a lot to do with what these policies are all about. He just wants to have his ring kissed or someplace less savory than that. It's really just a remarkable thing to watch one person cause such turmoil because of his own psychological issues.
Yeah, I was going to say there was an interesting piece by Adam Tooze that I was reading recently where he said that a lot of people talk about the Mars-a-Logo Accord thinking that there's a logic to all of this. And he said, well, what if there is no logic? What if it's just, Trump has been talking about tariffs since the 80s and he believes this regardless of whether it's true or not?
Yeah, I mean, you could say bringing back manufacturing to the U.S. is a worthy goal. You know, I'm not opposed to that. There's an awful lot of sentimentality and delusion involved in some of these projects, but okay. But the Biden administration is actually doing something along those lines with the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. I have problems with the way it was engineered, but it actually was a way of reindustrializing the United States and also focusing on really advanced industries. Trump wants to bring back steel mills. I think his whole model is he wants to bring back the world of 1955 when white men ruled the world and there were big, nobody had to worry about pollution or climate change or the demands of uppity women and minorities. Just bring back those nice old days. Of course, there's a lot of fantasy involved in that memory of 1955, but I think that's what a lot of his, what drives a lot of his policies. It's just this strange nostalgia. It's in a lot of ways, very un-American. American culture has always been about the future. I think Emerson said, "I'm an endless seeker with no past on my back. I unsettle all things." That's not. I mean, Trump is one of the most backward-looking people to acquire any status in American politics I can think of.
I know we said earlier that it's been like 30 minutes before we did this interview. Everything has seemingly changed. What do you make of these new developments?
Well, I think he realized it was going too far. The so-called reciprocal tariffs and the crazy formula he used to come up with them made no sense and were actually looking very, very destructive. And the fact that the markets immediately turned around. They were not collapsing earlier in the day, but they went from down, I don't know, 2% to up 7% in the space of moments once he announced these things. And he claims that he's about Main Street, not Wall Street, and the Trump of the first administration, where the stock market was a real-time report card on policy. He claims he's rejected that, turned against it. But you can say that movements in the stock market sometimes are absolutely pointless. They march to their own drummer. A lot of noise, not so much signal. But in this case, it was signaling something real, which is real anxiety about serious economic dislocation, recession, not just recession, but really deep structural problems that he was imposing. We have enough structural problems of our own without imposing them. But then on top of that, the behavior of the bond market over the last several days has been very strange and worrisome in that normally when you have financial turmoil and the stock market's heading down, investors pile into U.S. Treasury bonds as the cliche is a flight to safety. That didn't happen this time. But the opposite happened. Now, we don't know what it is. There's some talk about some kind of technical trade that hedge funds were doing being unwound, or China dumping a large amount of its treasury holdings. China holds about 3% of all outstanding U.S. Treasury bonds at the moment, or did as of January. Who knows what it is now? But they could be dumping it. But whatever it was, it's very distressing to see the bond market looking so troubled. You would think that in the case of an oncoming recession, which probably meant, well, I don't know, not a recession usually means deflation, which would lower interest rates. But in this case, I don't know. We're looking at inflation if when the tariffs take effect. Even so, he called off the retaliatory tariffs, but the higher baseline and the higher tariffs on China will take effect. Supposedly, we'll see. Well, they already have taken effect, but we'll see how long they last. But that's going to be inflationary, and it's going to take a few months to work through the system. But we should start seeing serious price increases coming in May and June. And for a guy who was elected partly on Biden's inflation, for him to be driving prices up is just politically bizarre and remarkable. I mean, the Yale Budget Lab had estimated that with the retaliatory tariffs, which are now postponed for 90 days, whatever that means, it would raise the average cost to the average household by about $3,000 a year. And for people in the bottom part of the income distribution, about 4%. And, when you're in the bottom 10 or 20% of the income distribution, you need every penny you can get. So a 4% cost increase is a lot. That he was going to engineer that, would have been politically disastrous. I think he finally maybe understood that this has been a political disaster for him.
Yeah, and I think the other point you've made is that, you've written about Trump's tariffs before. We should note you've written about it on the Left Business Observer news blog back in January, and for Jacobin. And one thing you've pointed out about Trumponomics, it's called, is that it's going to hit the poor far harder than the rich, and it doesn't actually do anything to stimulate domestic production, which is the claimed intended purpose.
Yeah, it is very regressive. Tariffs are regressive. The further down you are in the income distribution, the larger percentage of your income you consume, which means the more the tariffs will hit you. Obviously, the financial turmoil will hit the upper brackets more than the lower brackets. But if it's a financial turmoil that's just a foretaste of real economic turmoil, then that's another story. But I was just reading a piece, I think it was the Financial Times just moments ago, where they talked to a bunch of people who know these things. I don't really understand, how to build things myself. I'm just a guy sitting in a room in Brooklyn. But they were saying it takes 3 to 5 years to build a factory of any complexity. Some even more complex factories can take 7 years to build. So, okay, yeah, bring back manufacturing to the U.S., but it's going to take years and years for even the beginning of that to show. And going back to Biden, and I don't want to sound like a Biden cheerleader, but he we saw a real boom in the construction of factories in the computer chip sector. Really remarkable stuff if you look at the Census Bureau's construction numbers. And that shows that kind of industrial policy can have a positive effect. But, it's a constructive industrial policy, one that's designed to stimulate investment. And this kind of blockage that's going to, and we haven't even talked about the damage it will do to the poorer countries. A country like Vietnam or Cambodia, which would have been slapped with insanely high tariffs under the reciprocal tariff plan, now postponed, would have been extremely damaging. Cambodia exports clothing to the U.S. Most Nike products are made in Vietnam. It's a very funny clip from Dave Chappelle from years ago where he said, I want to wear Nike shoes. I don't want to make them. I think a lot of Americans would feel that way. But that aside, a lot of people in Vietnam get out of the rice paddies by going to work in a factory, a shoe factory, and for some people, that's an improvement in their lives, and this is going to be very damaging to them. So, and then if we look at just what's happened in North America, the auto industry in North America, it's very disruptive. Canadian workers and Mexican workers. The UAW supported these tariffs without really consulting with their Mexican or Canadian counterparts. Yeah, there's a real ugly nationalist streak to this stuff I really don't like either.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting what you said there about poorer countries. I was just speaking with the Quincy Institute's Karthik Sankaran, who he comes from a more neoliberal centrist perspective, but he was sort of saying the same thing about who's going to get hit by it. He said it's going to be poorer countries in the global south. And this sort of leads me into something I want to touch upon with you, which is it seems like this is getting criticized. This Trump tariff agenda is getting criticized by everyone from, a libertarian right winger like Thomas Sowell, or even, Jim Cramer recently, to even people that I think
Cramer was a Spartacist in his youth. So
well, that's true.
maybe that's coming back. Because Spartacists are always internationalists, or Trotskyists are always internationalists. They hate protectionism.
Right. Well, I was going to say, I've even seen some criticism from protectionists who think the tariffs are too sweeping and too broad. That, tariffs can be good if they're targeted, So I see everyone criticizing that. Can you maybe explain uh, why there is such a wide array of seemingly conflicting voices that are all coming together saying, this agenda is bad news?
Well, I mean, the most salient issue is that the tariffs are crude and stupid. They're just really, the formula they used to come up with the numbers, the now postponed reciprocal tariffs was just ludicrous. The guy whose work they drew upon to come up with them said, "This is nonsense. This is not what I meant at all." And he teaches at the University of Chicago Business School, so he's not like some raving liberal or anything. And you could use our tariffs. That's part of an economic development strategy, but has to be part of an economic development strategy with a whole bunch of industrial policy, stimulate education, training. And Trump is doing it at the same time as they're launching a war in education, higher education in particular. What sense is there in cutting the National Institutes of Health? I mean, what's like they're cutting gonorrhea tracking, but the CDC, like they're just this reckless cutting of just the kinds of government spending you need. Even if you don't have to be a social democrat or a socialist to say that support for science and education is a good government policy, and to see this being cut at the same time they're trying to encourage the reindustrialization of the U.S. makes no sense. It's a completely incoherent, reckless, stupid policy done by a vain. And I don't know, Trump isn't exactly stupid because he does have some political skills. He is a canny survivor. Every time you count him out, he's back. I mean, he does have something going on there, but he is a profoundly ignorant man. For example, he's going on the other day about how the best time in the history of the U.S. was from 1870 to 1913. Over half of that period was spent in recession or depression, according to the official NBER scorekeeping. So is that what he wants? Spend there was one like 6-year depression in the 1870s. Like, is that what he wants? But I don't think he even knows that. I mean, he goes on about McKinley. When McKinley was in Congress, he engineered a big tariff in 1890, October 1890. The Republicans got creamed a month later in the midterm elections. So it's just his knowledge of history is there is none. I mean, if anything, it's like negative. It's wrong. It's exactly the reverse of what's true.
One thing I wanted to dive into here with you is, you know, I want to delve into Bidenomics versus Trumponomics, and maybe we could start with, when it comes to what we call Bidenomics. I know you have criticisms, but you also have said earlier, there were good things that were done under Biden. So what's the pro and con of the sort of Bidenomics era?
It's funny. I was supposed to write a piece for Jacobin uh, on Bidenomics in, I don't know, I guess it was the summer of 23. And I was going to say nice things about him. And then he supported the Gaza war. And I said, okay, I can't say any nice things about this guy. So I put the piece on the shelf because I didn't want to have to say anything nice about him at that point. But then I went back to it. I can't remember what it was, probably about a year ago. And, I said in the opening that I was going to write this piece a while back, but I didn't want to say anything nice about it because of the Gaza war. But, here's Bidenomics. And there are some good things in there. Like I said, the CHIPS Act was a subsidy to the to that industry. It just about covered Intel's stock buybacks over the previous 10 years, the money that was going to go to Intel. So a lot of it was just covering money that the chip makers were sending along to their shareholders, and now they wanted to get a free money from the government to do it. But on the other hand, stimulating R&D, stimulating production in advanced economic sector. And there were things in the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, that were good. The Infrastructure Act had too much emphasis on roads and highways, not enough on transit. But on the other hand, like some of the climate stuff in the IRA was good, stimulating the production of clean energy sources. That was good, and this would have, not only been good for the climate, but actually created jobs, pretty good jobs. And it was for some reason, they thought that locating a lot of these projects in red districts was going to help them out politically. Well, they didn't really get much credit for that. They did a terrible job selling these things. Most people are not aware of the extent of the initiatives that Biden undertook under the broad rubric of industrial policy. And they were going to have a long payoff. It's going to take years for people to really start feeling the effects of these, but they were good. I mean, he should have been out there, touting every plant opening or whatever, every repaired road, whatever. But he was incapable of doing it.
It's funny that you say that because I feel like the Biden team didn't actually tout any of this enough.
No, they didn't, and I don't think Harris mentioned it at all. And Biden himself could not have managed a ribbon cutting because his attention would have been distracted by some peripheral event and he'd wander off. Yeah, I mean, there were some good things there. He had some good advisors. I actually knew some of his advisors way back from when they had a radical past. And they're good people, smart people with good ideas. And some of them were drawn upon, but then, I don't know, they just did a terrible job politically selling this stuff.
Were there any criticisms you get? Because I was listening to your interview on the Bituation Room podcast.
Oh,
you
yes.
said you do have criticisms of Bidenomics, but I didn't hear you get into them as much.
Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of it was just too oriented towards tax subsidies and breaks. Not enough direct public investment, too much in the way of trying to stimulate investment indirectly. And those things don't always work very well. Not enough in the way of requiring the firms that were getting subsidies to actually make the investments they were supposed to make. As I recall, shortly after the CHIPS Act was signed, Intel and several other major chip producers announced cutbacks in capital spending. So, it was just too reliant on these kind of Clinton-esque incentives and not enough on direct government investment. And I think that was not only bad in the economic sense, but I think it's important to challenge that the market is always right, use market mechanisms, nudging things, that Cass Sunstein nudge stuff and all that crap. Rather than say, no, we could look back at the Tennessee Valley Authority, like that was a great thing. FDR, through really large scale federal investment in the 1930s, transformed that region of the country from deeply poor to, still poor, but it's not anywhere near as poor as it was relative to the rest of the country. That was an extremely successful policy. That'd be a great model for doing clean energy, economic development in the busted heartland, all that sort of thing. But I think a combination of the overall political environment and the Democrats' timidity about challenging that political environment led to all these weak compromises that, better than nothing, were still too close to nothing to be transformational.
I think the big thing for me is that at least with Biden, or Bidenomics, there was sort of coherence. I feel like the sort of Trump regime approach is at times people will say, oh, this is like a return to libertarian ideas, and then people will say, oh no, it's actually a return to protectionism and nationalism, and it just seems like it's a very incoherent regime.
Well, I don't see anything libertarian about bundling up people and sending them off to prison in El Salvador. That's
right.
Or like kicking people out for their speech. That's really bad stuff. And I was a libertarian in my youth, and I still am not completely. I haven't shaken off the influence, and I think that's just absolutely awful stuff. It's Bonapartist, I think, is one of the adjectives that people use to describe it. This figure of Trump himself. You look back, historic fascism. These were large movements with large parties and some degree of popular support. The Trump thing is just this personalized cult. It's a cult of personality, really. And to watch all these people around him professing loyalty as if he were, I don't know, the voice of God. It's it's really depressing and distressing to see that people acting so stupidly. And there's also these divisions within his circle. It's very really amusing to watch uh, uh, Musk calling Peter Navarro dumber than a bag of bricks, and then amending that to say that that insults bricks. It's just well, Navarro is an idiot, but on the other hand, Musk is a horrifying character in his own way. So I don't know. It's incoherent is certainly one of the first words that come to mind when you describe that crew. Both in the kinds of support, the sources of their support, and their political program. It just makes no coherent sense at all. It's just whatever Trump wakes up feeling a bit like. Yeah, I mean, there's one day, a few weeks ago, where there were 3 tariff policies in one day. I mean, today we have just 2. We're getting off light.
I was just going to say, I agree with you about the El Salvador prisons. This is not very libertarian. I think people will try to argue that the Doge stuff is libertarian, but I don't even know about that. And the tariffs certainly, I don't think, line up well with libertarianism at all. It just seems like there's so many factions that make up MAGA at this point, and they're all constantly at war with each other and at the whims of one man, basically.
Well, it's really hard to imagine Steve Bannon and Elon Musk and all these people under one political roof. They just have a lot of differences. But there's nothing libertarian about like a handful of guys led by the richest guy on the planet, just going in and pulling wires, in the deep reaches of the federal government's computer systems, canceling programs for reasons no one knows. I don't think any of these people have any idea what they're doing. They're just reckless. I mean, Musk himself has a temperament of every time I say I have a 14-year-old, I think back to my own son when he was 14. He was far more mature and balanced than Musk has ever been. Yeah, I mean, that kind of adolescent sensibility, and then the gang of guys in their 20s who are doing a lot of the work, big balls and company. That's just they don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what the government does, and they think, "Oh, this is neat. Let's just cut this." Like it's just chaotic and stupid. There's a deep streak of nihilism among these people too. They just want to blow shit up, and then on top of that, I think there's a deep eugenics streak among them. They really want to see the poor and the sick and the old just die away. And like that, the games they were playing with Social Security, they retreated on the phone calls at Social Security sometime earlier on Wednesday. But on the other hand, it's just making it so difficult for people to sign up for Social Security or deal with their problems with it. I think they really just hope people can't get their benefits and just die. And you can see that in a lot of these, especially in the Silicon Valley people around Musk. The Peter Thiel contingent. They're just profoundly misanthropic and eugenicist.
Yeah, I just had 2 more questions, and you've sort of hit on one already, which is I think I wanted you to delve more into the sort of dark, very mean-spirited nationalism you see underpinning this sort of Trump movement, and also the misanthropy. I think you've done a good job highlighting that misanthropy, and it's really a part of it.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I think they really just don't like people. It's funny. I was always very critical of Ralph Nader's trade policy. I'm an internationalist. I think trading with people is a good thing. I think economic relations, cultural relations across countries, these are all good things. I think people should be free to move around to the greatest practicable extent possible. So I always had problems with the anti-globalization movement of the 90s for this reason. I never shared those localist and nationalist dreams a lot of them had. And I think we're paying a price for that now, not having been able to articulate a progressive nationalism, as opposed to the neoliberal internationalization that we saw over the last few decades. And it'd be nice to be able to articulate that now. But yeah, I think it's just there's a contempt for the outside world. You could hear it in the way that Trump pronounces the word China. He just hates Chinese people. It's so palpable. And a lot of the people around him just hate Latin Americans. They find them creepy, and all the racist attitudes. Like, just get these people out of here. Oh, and I started to talk about Ralph Nader. Nader has a real germ phobia, as does Trump. And I think they both see like foreign trade as somehow an incursion of foreign bodies or bad infections coming from the outside world to damage the American body politic. And that is exactly the opposite of how I see the rest of the world. I welcome the rest of the world. I think we should need to be less provincial and not more. But the MAGA movement is, just extremely provincial and proud of it.
You've actually sort of touched upon the very last thing I wanted to hit upon with you, which is there's a lot of talk now about, well, isn't this what the left of the anti-WTO protests would have wanted in the 90s? And I wanted you to just comment on that whole line of discussion that people are having. Maybe you can give your thoughts on the legacy of the anti-WTO protests.
Yeah, I wrote a piece in the review of the Baffler a few months ago about an oral history of that period. And I've been ready. I was there for that week, the Seattle WTO week in 1999. And I found it really exciting, but I had a lot of reservations about it. I thought nobody really had a vision of what kind of world they wanted to see. There was a lot of sentimentality about the local, about self-reliance. And I think self-reliance is an exaggerated virtue. I think I'm much more for cooperation and interdependence. And I think there probably were some people who wanted tariffs and globalization and all those, and all those things. But whatever it was, and even if it was all very vague, they wanted a more humane and egalitarian world. There's nothing humane or egalitarian about what Trump is doing. So, I mean, you can say that, okay, that both forces, both that anti-globo force of 20, 30 years ago and the Trump force today, both are looking to undo globalization. But I think what they want to emerge on the other side of that undoing is quite different. There was a vague, but certainly I wouldn't even say socialist because it was not a particularly ideological formation. It was just, but the sentiments were much more solidaristic and cosmopolitan than anything you could see out of the Trump administration, which is just all about the war of each against all.
Can I ask if it's okay, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but what for you would be like an alternative to both sort of that progressive nationalism we saw at the end of the 90s and also the neoliberal globalization that we've seen? I know that's a big question, but maybe
Yes.
like a brief version of it.
Well, I would see, let me say this. I think, for example, there's a lot of hatred directed towards the WTO in those days. And I can understand why. But on the other hand, in principle, there's no reason why we shouldn't have an international organization that's supposed to regulate and negotiate trade. And that should be done, and actually the fact that the WTO is a one country, one vote organization, unlike the IMF and World Bank, which are weighted by incomes. Some elites just didn't like the WTO for that reason, and it was never very well funded. The Columbia economist Jagdish Bhagwati once told me that the travel budget of the IMF was larger than the entire budget for WTO, which shows you something about priorities. But so I think we could imagine a more democratic WTO, one that and a lot of what went on under the rubric of trade negotiations and free trade agreements that were much more about investment and giving corporations the right to sue and to block governments from doing policies they didn't like, foreign governments. So, a U.S. corporation could sue Honduras for what it saw as an incursion on their right to invest. That stuff is bad. But I would say, like, for example, some kind of trade organization that regulated trade on more egalitarian principles, and one that brought things like labor and environmental standards into the trade calculations. Those would be good.
Just real quick, like I said, I don't want to draw this out too long, but what would trade under more egalitarian principles look like?
Well, for example, we wouldn't so much trade occurs because wages have been repressed in the poorer countries through coups directed by the CIA or various means to destroy independent unions. So I would like to see wages raised in those poorer countries through policy and through unionization and through labor standards in the importing countries, so that it's just not about exploitation. Same with the environmental standards. A lot of the charms of producing in poorer countries is that there are no environmental standards, and that would be a good thing to have, environmental standards. So I would like to see those things be part of the whole trade package and trade agreements, whether like NAFTA, for example. Whatever Trump renamed it. I can never remember how he renamed it. But that was not going to happen, is because the whole point of these agreements was to take advantage of wage disparities and environmental regulation disparities and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think trade agreements should incorporate those kinds of higher standards, and under American law, we should require decent working conditions and environmental standards for the producing countries. I mean, that's not international socialism, but it's an improvement on this dog-eat-dog world we have.
Well, hey, Doug Henwood, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views and for giving me like an extra 5 or so minutes to continue speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Happy to do it. It's always good to talk to you.
How can my listeners keep up with your work?
Everything I do is on my blog, lbo-news.com, lbo-news.com.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.